All right, let's talk about some differences between the United States and Mexico. Number one on my list is homelessness. In the United States, you have a high degree of homelessness, driven, I think, by mental illnesses and drug abuse, and also probably enabled by the welfare system in the United States. In Mexico, you don't see that. So, I've been to a lot of the cities in Mexico. I live in Playa del Carmen. It is very, very, very rare that I see a homeless person. I'm not saying there none exist. I'm saying it's very rare. The drug addiction that probably happens here, as with any country, the people get up and go to work the next day. Same thing with alcoholism. They don't get paid to stay home. And I think that has a lot to do with people staying employed and not being homeless. And then speaking of drug addiction, the drug addiction problem in the United States is probably 1,000 to 1,000,000 times worse in the United States than it is in Mexico. Yes, you have people doing drugs. Yes, you have people drinking beer that drink a lot. However, you don't have it to the degree where they can't work or can't, have a home or anything like that. So it's a big difference when you step into Mexico and you don't see that element of society. You don't see the drug issues. You don't see the homelessness. And so those are, very, very eye-popping when you come to Mexico. Now, the other part I would say is obesity. Now, obesity is high in Mexico, but it's nowhere near as high as it is in the United States. So when you get off the plane, when you walk around the city, it doesn't matter. When you're amongst locals, you just don't see the obesity like you have in the United States. And why is that? I don't know. Maybe it's a better diet, a little bit better diet. Maybe it's more exercising. Who knows? But you don't tend to have the same issues. Another thing that you notice in Mexico is Mexico has a very young population. The average Mexican is only 27 years old. That's one of the reasons that makes Mexico so competitive in the world manufacturing environment, because they have a very young workforce, which means they've got a steady supply of workers for the next 30, 40 years. Whereas the United States workforce is an aging workforce similar to China. The average age of the person in the United States is upwards of nearing 40 years old. So that's a big difference. Some other big differences you have are schools. In Mexico, the students still fear the teacher. So when I was going to school, we feared the teacher. The teacher was the boss. The teacher controlled the schoolroom. The United States has, lost that ability in the public school forum and often in the private school forum, where the teachers no longer control the classrooms, the students control the classrooms. A lot of times, especially in the inner cities, the teachers are sitting in the back of the class, just completely disconnected from the students. In Mexico, the students all respect the teacher. The teacher, can discipline the child or talk to the parent. The parent will discipline the child. And consequently, I think the average, Mexican student only goes through the equivalent of about 8th grade. And then a lot of them will either go to the college route and continue in school, or they'll drop out and go, start working with their dad or, doing something in manufacturing or construction. And what's interesting about that is you would say that, okay, well, on average, the United States kids are more educated than the kids in Mexico. But when you talk to the kids in Mexico, every one of them can read. So for instance, if I don't know how to say something in Spanish, I can type it into my translator and then I can just show it to them. I've not found one person in Mexico that could not read what I was showing them. And the literacy rate in Mexico was approaching something like 99%, whereas I believe the literacy rate in the United States is around 70%. So obviously the schools are doing a much better job. The other thing that you notice in terms of education is no matter where you go, whether you're at a restaurant, whether you're at a convenience store, whether you're at a gas station, people know how to count change here without using a machine. So they'll even suggest, hey, do you have 20 or do you have 10 pesos or 15 pesos or whatever to give you whole dollar bills back or whole peso bills back. Whereas in the United States, you give somebody say your total's 507 and you give them 1010, they look at you like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? I don't know how to calculate this. So just basic level, the Mexicans, I believe, are much more educated, and I think it has to do with the teachers still have control of the classroom. There's still a lot of respect for the teachers, and they haven't lost control. And then when you go to private schools are magnitudes better than private schools in the U.S. The kids here that go to private school, I would say the average cost is about $300 a month, and they spend about half their time learning Spanish and half of their time in English. So half the class is in Spanish, half of it is in English. And when those students happen to go back to the U.S. to go to private schools, they're usually 1 to 2 grades ahead by the time they hit 6th grade. So anyway, just what I've observed is these types of things, and like I said, the schools are much, much better. The other thing I would say is different are the beaches. So you can go to the beaches in Mexico, and virtually all of them have warm water. There's a stretch probably from Ensenada to Cabo where the water is not so warm, but the beaches are very, very warm. And I would say every beach in Mexico is better than pretty much any beach in the United States. So I think hands down, beaches in Mexico are awesome. The ones on the East Coast here in Quintana Roo are all in the Caribbean Ocean, or almost all in the Caribbean Ocean, and are among the most beautiful beaches in the world. Some other differences, the middle class. So both the United States and Mexico have roughly 50% of their population is middle class. However, the Mexican middle class population is increasing every year, whereas the United States middle class population is decreasing every year. So that's another difference that we see. The other thing I would say is with doctors, rock star doctors in Mexico are kind of the norm, where rock star doctors in the United States are a rarity. So I'll give a plug here to Dr. Eric Serrano. He is my favorite doctor in the United States. He's also one of the most knowledgeable doctors on the planet, and his level of knowledge is probably unsurpassed in the United States. He probably knows more about medicine than virtually any doctor in the United States. And in Mexico, you have a high percentage of doctors that are on Dr. Serrano's level of intelligence and the way he practices. So they very much are trying to fix you. They're not trying to treat you. And that's what I admired about Dr. Eric Serrano, and that's what I admire about the doctors in Mexico. So if you're thinking about, what's the healthcare like, as long as you get near a big city that has a tier 1 hospital, I can tell you you're covered from if you got a tier 1 hospital nearby, you're covered for everything. And then just seeing general practitioners here, these guys are freaking amazing. And I guess another big difference would be family. So the family is different here in that it's a much stronger, cohesive unit in Mexico than it is in the United States. And I like that about Mexico. Pretty much all families in Mexico get together either every Saturday or every Sunday, and they do that religiously week after week after week, and they spend that time together. And I think that's a very big deal, and I think that's something the United States used to do that we've gotten away from. And then finally, the other big difference between the United States and Mexico, I would say, is religion. And the United States seems to have lost its way with religion. They've lost its way a lot, I think, with morality. I know a lot of you guys will argue me with that. That's fine. That's just my impression. Whereas Mexico, 91% of the population of Mexico, they still identify as being Christian, and approximately 87% of those are Catholics. So those are some interesting differences, I think, between the United States and Mexico. And like I said, I tend to love living in Mexico. I think it's a lot like living in the United States 50 years ago from kind of a family values and ethics point of view. And that's my take. So let me know what you guys think about this.